the lonely sea, the lonely sea. It never stops for you. It moves along from day to day. You're like the lonely sea.
Good afternoon. I'm not mic'd, but those of you who've been my students know that I don't need a mic. I'm Professor Todd Teachin from UMass Lowell English Department. I'd like to welcome everyone to the opening event in this year's Jack Kerouac's birthday celebration in Lowell, which is celebrating Kerouac's 90th birthday. Thank you all for taking the time to come out to this afternoon's event. Before I introduce our speaker this afternoon, I'd like to quickly point out that this year's events were co-sponsored by UMass Lowell and Lowell Celebrates Karouac. And I'd first like to acknowledge the work of my colleagues, Mike Milner and Paul Marion. They've done a lot of work in preparation for these events, which wouldn't have been possible without their contribution. These events also wouldn't be possible without the contribution of UMass Lowell's English Department and the Jack and Stella Karouac Center for American Studies. Lowell Celebrates Karouac, headed by its new president, Mike Worm, and its departing president, Steve Eddington, have also done a tremendous job in preparation for the next few days, which is typical. And the Jack and Stella Karouac estate, headed by John Sampis, who unfortunately is not here, has of course offered its support in various ways. That being said, it's with great pleasure that I welcome this afternoon's presenter, Dawn Ward. Dawn is a professor of graphic design and visual arts at Becker College, and she has a long scholarly commitment to the beat writers. She's done a commendable job of preparing Kerouac's previously unpublished 1943 novel, The Sea is My Brother, for publication. That has already appeared in the UK. It was supposed to, originally this event was supposed to coincide with the US release through the Capitol Press, but they've had a publication delay, so you should be able to get the US version in a couple of weeks. We did all that we could to have some copies here today, but it just wasn't possible. So I apologize for that. Nevertheless, I strongly encourage you to check out that book when it comes out, because the truth is that the volume that Dawn put together does a lot more than just reconstruct the first novel. She's included a number of early short stories and sketches that Kerouac wrote, and a sizable portion of early correspondence between Jack Kerouac and Lowell native, other Lowell native, Sebastian Sampis. And that I think, sheds tremendous light on Kerouac's early artistic development and intellectual development, something that isn't looked at enough, right? And asks you to think about the fact that long before Kerouac, the part of the story is that Kerouac gets to New York and Columbia, and the intellectual excitement, helps him become this artist. But it's clear from reading those letters that he's already well on his way when he's still living in Lowell. I'm going to stop for now and turn things over to Dawn, and allow her to tell you more about the novel and the history of the materials that she put together. So, Dawn Ward.
Thank you, Todd. I would also like to extend my thanks to the English department. for inviting me here to participate in this year's program celebrating Jack's 90th birthday. And the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac Committee for their hard work in putting together many exciting events. I'm honored to be here to discuss this work. The Sea is my brother, and I would like to express my deep appreciation to John Sampas, Jack's brother-in-law, and Sebastian's younger brother for the opportunity to edit such an important work. Kerouac has a way of bringing together such a remarkable group of people, and it's wonderful to see so many new and familiar faces today. What is it about Jack's work that creates such interest and enthusiasm? For many, it's the vivid details of his frenetic journeys across the American landscape, or it may be the search for truth or spirituality. And for others, it's the jazz rhythms of Kerouac's prose and the soulful compassion of his words. I've been interested in many aspects of his soul-searching genius over the years, but I'm deeply interested in his methods of spontaneous prose. Like many scholars, I picked up where the strongest evidence of spontaneity began in On the Road, and it wasn't until I began reading his letters to Sebastian and Jack's early journals that I recognized that he'd been using the energetic, rhythmic speech much earlier. The Sea is based on patterns of conversational speech and letters written in bar rooms, on trains, and hotel rooms. And it is the evidence of that stream of consciousness process that is clearly present and provides the foundation of Kerouac's spontaneous prose. He was already practicing many of the techniques that he would go on to publish in the Evergreen Review in 1959. Some of those, such as scribbled secret notebooks, wild typewritten pages for your own joy, something that you will feel will find its own form, are just some of the techniques that are evident in this first novel. In Jack's short autobiographical piece written in 1943 called Background, published in Paul Marion's book, Atop an Underwood, he talks of being inspired by his father's theater publication, Spotlight. At the age of 11, he says, I spent most of my time after school in my father's printing and editorial offices, dashing off publications of my own on the antique typewriter. During this time, Jack and Sebastian had become acquainted, and they and a few other Lowell friends would later form a group they called the Young Prometheans. Jack tells us in Farewell Sweet from My Trees that once I ran a newspaper, the Daily Owl. I printed it by hand with a pencil and pasted pictures at the appropriate spots, using my own delectable hand-wrought captions. Bill was my star reporter. My Hollywood correspondent was a melancholy little Greek boy named Sebastian. He came from another neighborhood, but had heard from afar of my publication. He used to submit his daily column with a sad smile, and I would print it laboriously into my paper. The Young Prometheans met informally to discuss various topics, including literature and the arts. In those sessions, they aspired, like other artists throughout history, to make an impact with their self-expression. They formed drama groups such as the Variety Players and the Pioneer Club. They produced plays and radio scripts. They recited poetry, created cartoons, wrote short stories, and sang to anyone that would listen. Although there are no specific references why the group was named after the mythical Greek titan, Prometheus, there are some relevant correlations between the myth and the objective of the Young Prometheans to embrace the brotherhood of mankind. The Sea is My Brother is Kerouac's first real attempt to fictionalize his own experiences in novel form. He had already produced several short works by this time, including several plays, a couple of detective stories, like this one, and he'd also written many sports reviews and some poetry, most of which showed promise. While at Horace Mann, then later at Columbia, Jack would regularly correspond to this group of friends. Jack and Sebastian's letters were filled with reading lists, favorite quotations, literary comparisons, and they became an intellectually fueled debate on the promise of mankind. One of their favorite subjects was the work of Thomas Wolfe, whose vision of America became an inspiration. Jack writes to Sebastian from Hartford in the fall of 1941 that he got the following books from the libraries by writers Wolfe, Soroyan, Halper, Dos Passos, and William James. What men! And Wolfe, the giant. You must read of Time in the River, all about Boston, Public Library, Esplanade, docks, etc. May go to Indiana soon to settle with Notre Dame. If so, I will take a room in Chicago Hotel and write, Young Writer, Remembering New York. During the first year at Columbia, Jack began a work he titled Journal of an Egotist in 1940, which he chronicled a few days of his life as a student. Here he states his intention. I wish to be a novelist, playwright, short story writer, in short, a man of letters. Therefore, I live partly to observe the world about me so that I can write about it someday, drawing from the fund of my memory. He began formulating his process by amassing notebooks full of observational accounts, childhood memories, ideas for stories, and reflections on his day-to-day experiences. They offer us a better sense of his practice and evidence that his spontaneous processes began long before he tried to harness them. Jack and Sebastian discuss these authors in detail throughout their writings, and in particular, a quote by Albert Harper becomes a repeated motif and is noted in a journal entry by Jack in 1943. Here, Jack uses the quote under his own heading, American Blues, connecting Halper's expression to the plight of all Americans caught in the headlights of poverty, war, and political upheaval. American Blues, Halper said, my arms are heavy. I got the blues. There's a locomotive in my chest, and that's a fact. Jack's correspondence with Sebastian over the years 1940 and 42 can be found in the Sea's two main characters, Bill Everhart and Wesley Martin. Both men are comprised of what Jack felt was his dual personality, which he described in his working notes for the novel as the solitary boy brooding over his rich inner life and the neighborhood champ shooting pool down at the club. These two elements of Jack are what readers have come to expect, and perhaps it's one of the most attractive qualities, part of his universal appeal. To See As My Brother was written during the winter of 1942-43 when Jack was 20, and not long after his first trip on the SS Dorchester, which he refers in the novel as the SS Westminster. Jack's reasons for signing up as a merchant marine were motivated in part by his frustration with Columbia and the football team, but more so by his patriotic desire to serve his country in this time of war. The war was all it took to put direction back into Jack's life. He writes to Sebastian on September 26, 1942, from Nova Scotia on his first trip on the SS Dorchester. Sebastian, hello, my comrade and cher ami. I shall be home soon, was not able to write before, and from Nova Scotia here in the excellent Seamen's Club I write. I'll be home for a week immediately after signing off the ship. Then I shall go down to Washington for memories of last spring, Jeannie, G.J., Paul, Meyerson, Ed Dutton. Following this, with a possible dash down to Asheville, I'm returning to New York for an apartment in the Village, at which time I expect you to join me, 10 days of life, and enter the Merchant Marine also. At the expiration of my shore freedom, we can grab a tanker for Texas, be home for Christmas, or a coalboat to Newport, Virginia, or South America, West Indies, Far East, Russia. What say? Are you still in the Navy Yard? I have further suggestions. We can discuss them my first week home, including everything under the sun, from Picasso, Corot, interpretive dancing, and Prometheanism, the subtlety of Johnny Kumatsoulis, and the Doris Mills affair. See you then. Fist up, your brother, Jean. Sebastian, having signed up for the Army, replies in October with a long letter, and he closes with this paragraph. Oh, well, October's here. I'm 1A in the draft. My friends are gone, and I have said farewell to art. I am building my foundation of truth, building it with tears of doubt. I am building an altar, building it here in the middle of the night. I am fashioning it out of humility, frustration, and defiance, and it is growing into a garden where the roses are not choked by weeds. Not long after Jack disembarks at SS Dorchester, his desire to return to the sea is expressed again in a letter to Sebastian written in November of 1942 from New York City. A relic of battered past and buried projects. Sebastian, this is going to be a short letter and to the point. I'm asking your advice. And not only that, I'm assuming you will make an important decision yourself. I have personally seen enough of the Navy regimentation here at Columbia. I don't believe I shall join the Naval Reserve. My money is running low and my family is once more in financial straits. And being truly myself, I am not too conceited about the prospects of a naval officer's uniform. In brief, I believe I shall go back to the Merchant Marine for the duration of the war as an ordinary seaman. I'm wasting my money and my health here at Columbia. It has been one huge debauchery. I hear of American and Russian victories, and I insist on celebrating. In other words, I am more interested in the pith of our great times than dissecting Romeo and Juliet. At the present, these are stirring, magnificent times. I feel like a fool each time I think of Pat Reel, and I'm not sorry for having returned to Columbia, for I have experienced one terrific month here. I had a gay, a mad, a magnificent time of it. But I want to go back to sea, for the money, for the leisure, and the study, for the heart-rending romance, and for the pith of the moment. Sebastian, come with me, come with me. Your maritime cadet business will last 22 months. Why, man, the war will be over by then. Do you want to waste 22 months of your poet's life in strict militarist regimentation at $65 a month? Certainly I don't, for I also considered that branch. Don't you want to travel to the Mediterranean ports, perhaps Algiers, to Morocco, Fez, the Persian Gulf, Calcutta, Alexandria, perhaps the old ports of Spain, and Belfast, Glasgow, Manchester, Sydney, New Zealand, and Rio, Trinidad, and the Barbados, and the Cape, and the Panama, and Honolulu, and the far-flung Polynesians. I don't want to go it alone this time. I want my friend with me, my mad poet brother. If you don't want to relinquish your present training position, perhaps it's forthcoming, then of course I shall go alone. But alone, Sam, and palely loitering. Highly driven by the passion of the times, Jack finds himself once again torn. The next time he hears from Sebastian, he is enlisted in the Army, and Jack finds himself alone, back in Lowell, waiting for the Navy to call him. That is when he begins to handprint The Sea Is My Brother. Jack began several stories based on his adventures at sea with different titles and characters. The Sea Is My Brother is the most resolved and the one that he marked as original, which directly correlates with this period of his life and his friendship with Sebastian. Karouac drew upon his experience as a merchant marine for several writing projects. Two Worlds for a New One, Heartbeat of the Sea, and a one-act play, The Seaman, are some variations on this theme. He also reminisces about the sea in Big Sur, as well as in Vanity of Deleuze, where in Books 7 and 8 he recollects some of the characters' journal entries and experiences he had at sea. Jack's journal at sea states his intention at someday turning his experience as a merchant seaman into a novel or a story. Up to now, I've refrained from introducing any characters in this journal for fear I should be mistaken due to a brief acquaintance with those in question, and should be forced to rescind previous opinions and judgments. Although the journal would create an acceptable log, he noted, he felt that he should tell the story within the story. He goes on to say that he shall perhaps one day want to write a novel about the voyage, and he would be able to find all the details. A true writer never forgets his character studies and never will. In reading some of these character studies, we see clearly Jack's intention in his notes on their physical descriptions, the general qualities that would help create the personalities for the novel later that year. Another interesting component of this work is Jack's use of politics, not a common theme in his later books. Politics are forefront in this work, where members of the crew discuss their views on the war and the various political movements openly. There was a discussion he had with Sebastian as the world around him was fraught with controversy, fear, and the impending war. There were often headlines in the papers of the communist and progressive movements that challenged the capitalistic society they lived in. These discussions on board the Dorchester are part of Kerouac's tension in the novel, pitting the sometimes narrow-minded against the fear and hatred of the unknown. Jack's duality is again expressed when his character Everhart remarks that Martin had set himself a purpose, and this purpose was the ideal of life, life at sea, a Thoreau before the mast. Conviction had led Wesley to the sea, confusion had led Everhart to the sea. Perhaps both of these had led Kerouac to the Dorchester. Many of the ships that were used by the merchant marines during World War II had been converted passenger ships like the Dorchester, which carried up to 314 passengers and their cars up and down the eastern seaboard. But in February 1942, the SS Dorchester entered the war effort as a United States Army transport, a USAT. After being converted to a troop ship in New York by the Atlantic, Gulf, and West Indies Company, she was given additional lifeboats and life rafts, as well as 4 20-millimeter guns, a 3-inch 50 caliber gun fore, and a 4-inch 50 caliber gun aft. Her large windows in the pilot house were reduced to slits, and the ship that once carried passengers would now carry 906 crew members and troops. When Jack signed up for the Dorchester, it was the ship's 4th mission as a USAT. The 5th mission ended in tragedy as the ship and many of its crew, some of which were friends of Jack, perished on February 3, 1943, about 100 miles off Greenland. Throughout The Sea Is My Brother, there are striking parallels to themes found on the road. A buddy story, the duo Wesley Martin and Bill Everhart, much like Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty, set off with traveling plans. Martin plans to hitchhike to Boston to sign up on a merchant ship, and in an impulsive moment, Everhart decides to come along. I'm going to read some passages from chapter 4 of the book. At 3 o'clock, they were standing at the side of the road near Bronx Park, where cars rushed past, fanning hot clouds of dust into their faces. Bill sat on his suitcase while Wesley stood impassively, selecting cars with his experienced eye and raising a thumb to them. Their first ride was no longer than a mile, but they were dropped at an advantageous point on the old Boston Post Road. The sun was so hot, Bill suggested a respite. They went to a filling station and drank 4 bottles of Coca-Cola. Bill went behind to the washroom. From there he could see a field and a fringe of shrubs steaming in the July sun. He was on his way. New fields, new roads, new hills were in store for him, and his destination was the seacoast of old New England. What was the strange new sensation lurked in his heart, a fiery tingle to move on and discover anew the broad secrets of the world. He felt like a boy again, and perhaps, too, he was acting a bit silly about the whole thing. Back on the hot flank of the road where tar steamed its black fragrance, they hitched a ride almost immediately. The driver was a New York florist en route to his greenhouse in Port Chester, New York. He talked volubly, a good-natured Jewish merchant with a flair for humility and humor. A couple of wandering Jews, he called them, smiling with a sly gleam in his pale blue eyes. He dropped them off a mile beyond his destination on the New York-Connecticut state line. Bill and Wesley stood by a rocky bed which had been cut neatly at the side of the highway. In the shimmering distance, Connecticut's flat meadows stretched a pale green mat for sleeping trees. Wesley took off his coat and hung it on his shoulder, while Bill pushed his hat down over his eyes. They took turns sitting on the suitcase, while the other leaned on the cliffside, proffering a lazy thumb. Great trucks labored up the hill, leaving behind a dancing shimmer of gasoline fumes. Next to the smell of salt water, drawled Wesley with a grass blade in his mouth, I'll take the smell of a highway. He spat quietly with his lips. Gasoline, tires, tar, and shrubbery, added Bill. Whitman's Song of the Open Road, modern version. They sunned quietly without comment in the sudden stillness. Down the road, a truck was shifting into second gear to start its uphill travails. "Watch this," said Wesley. "Pick up your suitcase and follow me." As the truck approached, now in first gear, Wesley waved at the driver and made as if to run alongside the slowly tolling behemoth. The driver, a colorful bandana around his neck, waved a hand in acknowledgement. Wesley tore the suitcase from Bill's hand and shouted, "Come on!" He dashed up the truck, leapt onto the running board, shoving the suitcase into the cab, and holding the door open, balanced on one foot for Bill. The latter hung to his hat and ran after the truck. Wesley gave him a hand as he plunged into the cab. "Whoa!" cried Bill, taking off his hat. "That was a neat bit of Doug Fairbank's stash." Wesley swung in beside him and slammed the door to. "That'll melt the fat off," roared the truck driver. "Hot as a son of a bitch, ain't it?" His laughter bellowed above the thunder of the motor. They roared and careened all the way to New Haven, traveling at a furious pace down hills and crawling with mounting wine uphill. When the driver dropped them off at the Yale University Green, the sunlight had softened to a pale orange. "Don't take any wooden nickels," counseled the truck driver, bellowing above the crash of his gears as he left him in his thunderous wake. "What now?" asked Everhart. They were standing on a broad pavement, swarming with shoppers bearing packages, men in shirt sleeves en route from work, sauntering Yale summer students, newsboys, and businessmen. The street was a tangle of autos, buses, and clanging trolleys. The green was a pageant of loafers. "First thing is to get the hell out of here," muttered Wesley, moving off. "Well, when do we eat?" "We eat in Hartford," said Wesley. "How much money did you say you had?" $3 or so. "I'll borrow some when we hit Boston," mumbled Wesley. "Come on." They took a State Street trolley and rode to the end of the line. They walked up the street for a few blocks and set up their hitchhiking post in front of a bakery. After 15 minutes of thumbing, an agrarian-looking old gentleman picked them up in his ancient Buick, all the way to Meridian, while the sun changed its color to a somber, burning orange, and the meadows cooled to a clean, dark, and jungle green. The farmer carried on a monologue on the subject of farm prices, farm help, and the United States Department of Agriculture. "Playing right into their hands," he complained. "A man ain't got no faith in a country that'll let a powerful group knock off the whole darn agricultural economy for their own interests." "Do you mean the farm bloc?" inquired Everhart, while Wesley, lost in thought, sat gazing at the fields. The farmer tooted his horn 4 times as he barked 4 words. "You're darn tootin' right." By the time he dropped them off on the outskirts of Meridian, he and Bill were just warming up to their discussion of the Farm Security Administration and the National Farmers Union. "Goodbye, lads," he called, waving a calloused hand. "Be careful now." He drove off chuckling, tooting his horn in farewell. Well, at this point in the novel, Wesley and Bill were on their way to the sea. Their excitement and this new adventure was predominant in their thoughts, and the energy built throughout. And when they get to Boston, they encounter some of Martin's old shipmates, and he's really eager to bring Everhart into this group. And he says, "Well, we're in Boston. What's on the docket?" "Well, the first thing to do," said Wesley, is leading his companion across the street, "is to mosey over to the Union Hall and check up on the Westminster. We might get a berth right off." They walked down the Hanover Street with its cheap shoe stores, bauble shops, and then they turned left at Portland Street, a battered door bearing the inscription, National Maritime Union. It led up a flight of creaking steps into a wide, rambling hall. Grimy windows at each end served to allow a gray light from the outside to creep inward. A gloomy, half-hearted illumination which outlined the bare, unfurnished immensity of the room. Only a few benches and folding chairs had been pushed against the walls. These were now occupied by seamen who sat talking in low tones. They were dressed in various civilian clothing, but Everhart instantly recognized them as seamen. There, in the dismal gloom of their musty-smelling shipping headquarters, these men sat, each with the patience and passive quiet of men who know they are going back to sea, some smoking pipes, others calmly pursuing the pilot, the official MU publication. Others were dozing on benches, and all possessed of the serene waiting wisdom of a Wesley Martin. They made arrangements to be on hand and near the office door that afternoon when the official ship calls from the SS Westminster would be posted. And although Harry warned them those first come would be first served. 2:30 sharp, he grunted. If you're not here, you don't get the jobs. Wesley introduced Meade to Everhart, and they all went around the corner for a quick beer. Meade was a talkative, intelligent young man in his late 20s who stroked an exquisite brown mustache with voluptuous afterthought as he rambled on, a faint twinkle in the bland blue eyes. Walking in quick-stepping glide that wove between the pedestrians as though they were not there. On the way to the bar on Hanover Street, he shouted at least 3 insults to various passerby who amused his carefree fancy. At the bar, he and Wesley reminisced noisily over their past experiences together, all of which Everhart drank in with polite interest. Some other seamen hailed them from a corner booth. They all carried their beers over, and an uproar of reunion ensued. Wesley seemed to know them all. But a half hour later, Wesley rose and told me to meet him in the Union Hall at 2:30, and with this, he and Everhart left the bar and turned their steps toward Atlantic Avenue. Now for your seaman's paper, he said to Bill. Atlantic Avenue was almost impossible to cross. So heavy was the rush of traffic, but once they had regained the other side and stood near a pier, Bill's breast pounded as he saw, docked not 100 feet away, a great gray freighter, its slanting hull striped with rust, and a thin stream of water arching from its scuppers, and the mighty bow standing high above the roof of the wharf shed. "Is that it?" he cried. "No, she's at Pier 6. They walked down the Maritime Commission, the air heavy with the rotting stench of stockpiles, oily waters, fish, and hemp. Dreary marine equipment stores faced the street, show windows cluttered with blue peacoats, dungarees, naval officers' uniforms, small compasses, knives, oilers' caps, seamen's wallets, and all manner of paraphernalia for the men of the sea. The Maritime Commission occupied one floor of a large building that faced the harbor. While a pipe-smoking old man was busy preparing his papers, Everhart could see, beyond the nearby wharves and railroad yards, a bilious stretch of sea spanning towards the Narrows, where 2 lighthouses stood like gateposts to the dim Atlantic. A seagull swerved past the window. An energetic little man fingerprinted him in the next room, cigarette in mouth, almost suffocating him as he pressed Bill's inky fingers on the papers and on a duplicate. "Now go down to the post office building," panted the little man when he had finished, "and get your passport certificate. Then you'll be all set." Wesley was leaning against the wall, smoking, when Bill left the fingerprinting room with papers all intact. "Passport certificate next, I guess," Bill told Wesley, nodding towards the room. "Right." They went to the post office building on Milk Street, where Bill filed out an application for his passport, and he was handed a certificate for his first foreign voyage. Wesley, who had borrowed $5 from Nick Meade, paid Bill's fee. "Now I'm finished, I hope," laughed Bill when they were back in the street. "That's all. Next thing is to get our berths on the Westminster, am I correct?" "Right." "Well," smiled Bill, slapping his papers, "I'm in the Merchant Marine." At 2:30 that afternoon, Wesley, Bill, Nick Meade, and 7 other seamen landed jobs on the Westminster. They walked from the Union Hall down to Pier 6 in high spirits, passing through the tortuous weave of Boston waterfront streets, crossing the Atlantic Avenue and the Mystic River drawbridge, and finally coming to a halt along the Great Northern Avenue docks. Silently they gazed at the SS Westminster looming on their left, her monstrous gray mass squatting broadly in the slip, very much to Everhart's astonished eyes, like an old bathtub. The Sea is My Brother serves up many of Kerouac's poetic visions and gives us a new perspective in which to examine his development as a writer. His youthful exuberance is Jack's gift, which lives on through the enthusiasm and admiration of his readers. And thank you all for being here today to celebrate his work, and I would be glad to answer some questions about the novel.
Open to questions.
I guess since it hasn't come out in publication, it's hardly direct questions that many of you can ask about it, but maybe.
I was just curious, how's it selling in England?
I guess very well. It got quite good reviews and seems to be doing well. Too bad they won't sell it here yet.
With Amazon.
You had to get it on Amazon.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's the point of the U.S. version? Both countries speak English.
I know. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And then apparently they won't ship them over either. So we couldn't have them here today.
So they're going to be identical. It's just called.
No, they're actually not identical. The U.S. version has a slightly different introduction, and it is only the novel. It is not the additional material, which I think is, for scholars, certainly an important aspect of it.
So who made that deliberation and why?
The publisher. There was a question over here. Yes.
The overall tone of the novel, is it more optimistic like his other earlier works?
I would say you really get a sense of a very brooding and concerned young man. There is more intimacy to me to Jack as a person. You really see parallels to his life in the work. He makes a lot of connection to his own family experiences, and but through these characters. And he kind of takes both characters over. It's a combination of both of his personalities, I guess, if you will, although I think it's just more of what we all experience as two sides, the side we show and the side we keep inside to ourselves.
I forget if you mentioned this or not, but why was this published now? Was it just recently found, or was it just gathered from bits and pieces recently, or was it held on by someone?
No, it's been in the archive for a long time. I guess it was found in the late 90s. Excerpts were published in Paul Marion's book, Atop and Underwood, in 99, is that right, Paul?
Yeah, 99.
And it was mainly held to be published with this other material because it has a real importance to that period in his life that interacts with all those journals and early letters that would provide some scholarly information.
Is any of it laced with a language other than the American language?
The letters are full of French Canadian.
Full of what?
The French Canadian dialect. Jack's letters have a lot of French Canadian phrases in them and sentences and so forth, but other than that, no. Yes?
People ask questions when books like this appear, after an author is gone and works are brought forward, and in particular works from early stages, it could be Picasso's early drawings, or the writings of a younger Faulkner. Could you talk a little bit about what you saw, as a person, very involved in the Kerouac literary legacy, in these early works that sort of argue for bringing them forward?
Well, Much like the passage I just read, you can hear the energy, the continual sentences, the moment. He can draw these amazing, vivid pictures with words. And I do think that's his greatest gift to us. And that would be a reason alone. That and the fact that it offers a side of Kerouac that really people don't know. That it offers this highly concerned, very patriotic, very active, intellectual young man that we often think didn't happen until he went to Columbia. And I think that's the greatest argument for publishing it.
And I think the passage that you read too, when they're hitchhiking from New York to Boston, gets at Paul's question as well, right? Because there's this idea that Kerouac meets Neal Cassady, and On the Road happens because of Neal Cassady. But looking at that passage, it's clear that Kerouac already has this idea about these sort of dual male protagonists going on the road together, and he's just waiting to cast it with Cassady.
Right. Well, Cassady was a perfect fit. He was that energy, and all he had to do was follow him around and take notes, because he provided a lot of that. But yes, he already had these ideas, and I think if you read the letters, they talk about nothing but traveling and this, incredible need to see the world so that he can write about it. Yes.
I may be wrong, but I think didn't Kerouac one time say that he felt it was a poorly written book? I may be wrong, but do you think he was overly critical of himself in this particular writing?
In Vanity of the Lose, he wrote, after presenting a lot of his character studies, he spent about 4 chapters towards the end of the book talking about his experiences at sea. So obviously they were really important to him. But he does say that they were full of adolescent scribblings and not much as literature, but beautifully hand-printed. But we have to remember this was written towards the end of his life. He was a little detached and sad, and I do think he was very highly critical of his work. And if you look at artists who reach great fame and get attention for being brilliant, the tendency is to look back, as we all probably would, on our early works and think, oh well, I could have done that better.
So while he was on board the ship, he was doing his journals of day-to-day life, and then the novel I think I read was actually written
almost directly. Yeah, it was all written after he came back. He filled his small notebooks full of pages and pages and pages of all of these descriptions. He would describe breakfast, the clattering of the pans, the cooks, and how they would sing. And then he took all of that information and gleaned from it a story that he felt, both captured the experience, but then there was also this serious attempt to make a plot. And so in the beginning he creates the characters as they meet, with Martin being just coming off the ship and spending all of his money in a sort of drunken debauchery, in New York, and they connect and end up going out, and Everhart sort of is drawn in to the romance of it all and decides to go with him. And of course he has second thoughts many times throughout the novel. Yes?
Why do you think Jack Kerouac called his book The Sea Is My Brother?
Well, there are direct references to it. There is a placard in the Boston ship club, I guess, Seamen's Club, that says something to the effect of, for all those who go on to the sea, they're brothers. And this is part and part where he got that, I'm sure. And then there was also a lot of brotherhood of mankind. These were dominant themes in literature during the time. If you read any of the works that are mentioned by Dos Passos, they're often talking about Van Pearson also, and some of the others that he mentions. They're talking about brotherhood. It was a period in history where that was a sort of important theme. So to him, the sea was, in a sense, a family member.
Did he try to get the book published? Did he give up quickly in trying to get the book published? Did he try to publish parts of it?
He somewhat abandoned it. At the time, he was going through a crisis, which I talk a little bit about in the introduction. And towards the end of writing this novel, of course, he ends up in the Navy, and that's where he goes through this experience that he just can't handle. This was part and part what they were scrutinizing was this book. I'm trying to figure out why anybody would write this thing, and he decided that reality was what he should do. That it was, and he called it a supreme reality, or self-ultimacy period is often used too. And he began to kind of step back from this sort of spontaneity that he was generating and study Tom Wolfe. And that's when he wrote The Town and the City, which is very dry, very Tom Wolfian, been criticized often for that. Has some wonderful moments in it, certainly, but that's the one he said, if I'm going to be an American writer, this is what I should do. And so that's what he set out to do. And being what he felt was more important or more publishable, that's what he took to get published. Yes?
As he formed his literary friends with Burroughs and Ginsberg and the other folks that he began to meet from, I think, about 1944 on, and they were sharing their work. Do you know if this was part of the works that he shared with some of that literary camaraderie that developed, and if he got any kind of...
Not that I know of, but it's highly possible. I mean, he certainly was open. He mailed copies of this to his friends. He mailed a copy to Sebastian. They talked about it in letters. They were all very supportive of what he was doing, and they were so excited that he was trying to write a novel. It is possible, but I think once he got involved with The Town and the City and he sort of turned that corner, I don't think he went back to a lot of the old stuff until later in his life. Yeah.
He is curious to me, or I guess I found a passage maybe in Lonesome Traveler or Vanity. We took one last ship, was that Merchant Marine from San Francisco through the Panama Canal to New Orleans? So his California period.
Yeah, he went.
And he abandoned the ship in New Orleans.
Yeah, he went out 2 more
times.
He
wrote about it.
Mm-hmm. And that's in the Vanity.
Yeah,
really that's the last section of the Vanity. He talks about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it was such a. By that time, I guess he'd found the freedom of the road, but but this was still so.
I think you're right. I think the first time out was this, sort of amazing experience where there was a lot of solitude, and he really liked that. He enjoyed the smells and the sights and the new places. The second time out, he writes equally as fun about it, but there were similar kinds of people. The third ship apparently had some very rough characters, and he became a little less enamored by that, and decided, I think, that being in the car was more fun at that point, and abandoned ship. Any other questions? Yes.
I just wanted to come back to your comment about the politics and the patriotism. I think that's a really important element, both in the writings, this novel and others of the period, but also in his sort of life passage at the time, because people forget that he's a greatest generation age person,
Yes.
World War II generation, and Sebastian got killed in World War II.
Yes.
Several others of his friends.
Yeah, but Billy and
Yeah, and he always pointed to this as, well, this is what I did, and it was risky, as you said, the next time the Dorchester went out, it was torpedoed, but could you just expand a little bit about those thoughts that he expressed?
well, initially, Jack wasn't sure how he wanted to do it, how he wanted to serve his country. He was on the campus of Columbia. There was, the great speeches by Truman, all this stuff going on, and he would get kind of riled up, and he would write about it in his journals and letters to his friends. And then Sebastian, they would talk back and forth about sort of joining the service. I guess in some drunken moment, he ended up joining the service by accident and panicked and got on the Merchant Marine ship instead. There was a great deal of danger. They were actually transporting troops, bombs, guns, all kinds of stuff. They were, if you want to stop invasions on shore, then the U-boats were gunning for them. And many of these ships were taken out by the German U-boats. That's how this one was sunk.
Yeah, just to follow on that, not a question or observation in terms of the casualty rate in the Merchant Marine. I only discovered this. I'm doing some research and writing on Woody Guthrie right now, and he was also in the Merchant Marine, Second World War. And somewhere in the course of doing that, I came across a figure that said, if you took it as the ratio of the number of enlistees to the casualties, the Merchant Marine actually had the highest
I would
casualty
believe
rate.
that, because if they were sunk,
Once the ship got hit, they all went
Yeah.
down.
Yeah, in fact, there were only a few survivors, and there were 4 chaplains on the Dorchester. There's a wonderful book written about the 4 chaplains that died on the Dorchester. So it's a very, very interesting time. But it was extremely dangerous. It took a lot of courage. I think it also took a lot of courage to turn around and then join the Navy, too, because it really wasn't comfortable for Jack. He wasn't good with regiment. One of the reasons he truly liked the Merchant Marines is that they were regimented and they were serious, but they also knew how to have a little fun. And it was a variety of people that it wasn't quite such a, scheduled day. They had their responsibilities, but then they could have some downtime as well. Yes?
It's maybe an involved question, but it relates to Paul's question. And to me, the 2 most interesting decades politically in the United States in the 20th century are the 30s and the 60s. And Kerouac is sort of, that's his life, right, basically. And people tend to talk about Kerouac in the 60s, right, that, his ideas were so responsible for the counterculture in the 60s, but he was uncomfortable with that and sort of rejected it, right? But it seems to me that what's going on in this book is there's another window that's opened up, and that's Kerouac's relationships to the politics of the 1930s, right, which aren't even sort of greatest generation politics.
Mm-mm.
They're Marxist, they're socialist inflected, and I wonder if you could say something about what role that plays in some of the conversations on the ship, maybe some of, what are Sebastian's politics during this period when he's exchanging letters with Jack, or are they on the same page, are they different?
Well, neither one of them had any real interest in joining another party, but they were fascinated by the conversation, and they read the progressive newspapers, the PM, and the headlines. The headlines were amazing. Talking about the sort of disgruntled American, and how the war itself was certainly a cause for for protecting your country and nationalism and all of that, but also to the extent that it created a sort of grass is always greener. Like, well, maybe, because this is the Great Depression. People were starving, there were rations. I mean, you come out of a depression and into a war, terrible combination. And, you know, the headlines, you could only have one pair of shoes every year. It was really interesting to me to do the research. But back to your kind of question, the letters reveal a lot of conversation about whether or not things are fair, which I thought was profound and deep. When they really dig into it. They study these sort of radical Marxists and these people that have stood up and died for their various beliefs, and a lot of them belonging to these other parties, the Communist Party and so forth. And their main, it's this compassion that they feel that, you know, this isn't really a very fair situation, because regardless of where you're born, you sort of inherit those politics, and that you should have some rights to disagree. And they disagreed with some things that the Americans were doing as well. Yeah.
That's interesting.
As a scholar, why do you think Kerouac was so obsessed with the use of his mother tongue in the novels that he wrote in the American language?
I think a lot of reasons. I mean, it was certainly the sound of the language. It's very romantic. It gives him something different to offer. And he was highly connected to his roots and his family. He loved being French Canadian. So I don't know why he wouldn't want to use it. Yes?
I got a quick question while listening to some of the books out. Did Kerouac ever register to vote? Just a trivia question.
Well, that's a really good question.
No, he never voted in his life.
I don't think he did.
Ever.
Yeah, I don't think
Not
he
once.
did. Great question. Yeah.
Just like he never had a driver's license.
No, never had a driver's license either.
Which is amazing, right? As much as he traveled. Yeah. That's why he hooked up with such a good driver. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
There's a schedule of other events that are happening this weekend. You can grab one on the way out. This evening there will be an event at the Historical Park Visitor Center, a conversation with John Sampis, who is the literary executor of the Karouac estate, who will be in conversation with Mike Milner and I, and will also take questions about the handling of the estate, such as, why is this just appearing now? Which is a good question. Okay, thank you everyone.
Hi, I'm with Dawn Ward at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Dawn, this book you've written and edited, it's fascinating.
Yes, The Sea is My Brother. It's the first novel by Jack Kerouac, written about his experience as a merchant marine.
And everybody's fascinated by Jack Kerouac. I mean, I don't care if some people don't really know that much about him. The fascination never ends.
Well, I think his energy, his just overwhelming excitement about life, and he was a great writer. And even if you don't read a lot of the works, most everybody has read On the Road.
And, I think some people didn't realize, like you said, what a patriotic man he was, and he had different layers that people weren't aware of, apparently.
Oh, he had many layers, and I think that's what's the most important aspect about this book, is it reveals that the struggle, the experiences, serving his country, and certainly brings about many questions about Jack and answers that we had just never really realized, that he had all of this experience as a young man. And it's certainly I think his added to his later works. It gave him sort of a depth.
And I mean, he died at a relatively young age. Was he 47, I believe? But I mean, the short life he lived, he just did a lot of things. It appears. I don't know about the end of his life, but.
Well, he wrote all the way up into the end. One of the last books he did was the Vanity of Toulouse, and all of those things. I mean, that was his life.
Well, Don, the book is The Sea Is My Brother, and it was from the journals of Jack Kerouac, and you edited it and put it together. And it's a fascinating book. And is it a Penguin book or?
It's a Penguin book. It was published in the UK. The UK version has the collection of letters and journal writings and a few other unpublished works. The American version is by Da Capo Press, and it will just be the novel, and it comes out, I believe, next week, somewhere around March 15th.
Well, great, Don. Thank you. I heard you on CAP Radio the other day. That's how I found out about this event. And yeah, thanks for being on Havel Community Television. I really appreciate it.